Third story, The Last Stand of Valabrook. It all started when we were called in to fight. I was stationed at an old military base in Valabrook, a town nestled in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. The name sounded like something out of an old horror story, but none of us thought much about it, until that fateful night. I remember the day the orders came. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the dilapidated buildings. Our commanders told us that the enemy had breached the perimeter, and it wasn't just a regular attack, it was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, like something ominous was lurking in the shadows, waiting for us. "Get your gear, we're heading out," Lieutenant Carlson barked, his voice low and urgent. I grabbed my rifle, the weight of it familiar, but something in the air made me uneasy. The streets of Valabrook, usually quiet and unassuming, now felt like a battlefield. There were no sounds except the rustling of dead leaves in the wind, and it sent a chill down my spine. We made our way through the streets, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every corner. I saw soldiers around me, their faces tense and pale. As we moved deeper into the town, the fog began to roll in, thicker than usual. It wrapped around us, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Stay alert," Carlson ordered. "They're out there somewhere." I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The town, once so familiar, now felt like a haunted version of itself. Windows that had once gleamed with warmth now stared back at us like dark, empty eyes. The trees were bare, twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal hands. Then we heard it. A scream. A high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the streets. It sent a wave of terror through us. We ran towards the sound, our hearts pounding, adrenaline rushing. As we rounded the corner, we saw her. A woman dressed in ragged clothes, her face twisted in agony, her eyes wide with fear. But what caught my attention wasn't her. It was the shadow behind her. Something huge and dark moved just out of sight. "Get down!" Carlson shouted, but it was too late. The woman's scream turned into a gurgle as a massive dark figure lunged at her. It was like a beast, but not. A human shape with grotesque features, its limbs unnaturally long, its mouth wide and jagged. The creature dragged the woman into the shadows, leaving nothing but a trail of blood and broken pavement. We fired, but the bullets had no effect. The creature simply dissolved into the mist, as if it had never been there. "Keep moving," Carlson yelled, his voice now tinged with fear. We didn't question him. We couldn't. We were being hunted, and we knew it. We pushed forward, clearing building after building, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the soldiers anymore. Something had changed in the air. A malevolent presence that seemed to whisper our names when the wind howled. The fog thickened, and with it, the fear. It wasn't until we reached the heart of the town that we realized what was happening. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and the sky above grew darker than it had ever been. The town seemed alive, pulsating with some kind of unnatural force. Lieutenant Carlson looked at us, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't war. This is something worse." Before I could ask what he meant, the earth cracked open. From the depths of the ground emerged dozens, no, hundreds of those creatures. They were everywhere, crawling from the cracks in the earth, their twisted bodies contorting in impossible ways. We opened fire, but it was useless. They were relentless, unstoppable. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw him, the one who controlled them. A man, or at least I thought he was a man, standing at the center of it all. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, his face covered in scars that seemed to move, shifting like liquid. His voice rang out, low and menacing. "You shouldn't have come," he said, and the ground beneath us seemed to rumble in response. "Velebrook was never meant for you." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The fog closed in around us, the creatures tearing through our ranks. One by one, my comrades fell, their screams blending into the night. I ran through the streets, the fog swallowing me whole. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the presence of the creatures closing in behind me. I stumbled into the old church at the edge of town. Inside, it was silent. Too silent. I thought I was safe for a moment, but as I turned to look around, I saw the shadows shifting. It was then that I realized the truth. There was no escape. There was no safety. We had been brought here for a reason. Velebrook was never meant to be a place for the living. It was a place for the dead, and now we were part of it. The creatures, the mist, the whispers, everything had been part of the trap. And as I sat there in the dark alone, I knew that the creatures weren't just after us. They were after our souls. And once you were marked, there was no going back. The fog closed in around me, and I felt myself being pulled into the ground. My screams, like those of my fallen comrades, were lost in the abyss. Velebrook had claimed us. Second story, The Last March of Sentinel Hills. It was the summer of 2023, and the town of Sentinel Hills was as quiet as it had always been, until the war came. No one could have predicted it, but that's what happens when darkness falls upon a peaceful town. I remember the first signs, the sirens, distant and faint, growing louder with every passing hour. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. My name is Matt Harper. I never thought I would be a soldier. I had no interest in war, in fighting. But when the draft hit Sentinel Hills, everything changed. They came for us, the men of this town, young and old, and we had no choice. The government said it was our duty, and so we answered. We were sent to the front lines in a forgotten part of the country, somewhere near the crumbling remains of an old military base. The soldiers there had long since abandoned it, and what remained was nothing but rust and shadows. The moment we set foot on that land, I felt something stir beneath us, as if the earth itself was alive, waiting. But the fear was a distant hum compared to the urgency of war. We marched. In the weeks that followed, I grew numb to the horrors of battle. The enemy, if you could even call them that, was a constant presence, hidden in the darkness, striking when you least expected it. We fought through trenches, through forests that seemed alive with whispers. But there was something about the place, something ancient and suffocating that twisted the very air. It made everything feel wrong, as though we weren't just fighting a war against an enemy, but against something far worse. Then came the night we encountered them, the creatures. They were not human. Their eyes glowed red, and their bodies were twisted, as though they had been reshaped by the very chaos of the war itself. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. One by one, my comrades fell, their bodies torn apart in seconds, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. I ran. But what haunted me the most was not the creatures, nor the screams of my friends. It was the sound of marching. As I stumbled through the darkness, I could hear it, steady, rhythmic, like the beating of a heart. The sound grew louder with every step I took, and I realized it was coming from the ground itself. I wasn't running from the creatures anymore. I was running from the land, Sentinel Hills itself, as if it had awakened and was calling for us, for all of us. I didn't make it far. The marching surrounded me, coming from every direction. In a haze of panic, I looked back, and what I saw nearly broke me. The sky was dark with smoke, and there, amidst the chaos, stood a figure. It was the shape of a man, but something about it was wrong, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was as if the earth had given birth to this thing, as if it had been waiting for us to arrive. "Matt," the voice echoed, familiar but distorted. It was my father's voice, though I had buried him years ago. I couldn't stop myself. I stumbled forward, drawn to the figure, to the voice. I reached out, but the moment my hand touched it, a cold shock ran through me, and I fell to my knees. "Get up, Matt," the voice said, now thick with malice. "It's your turn to join the march." And then I understood. The war, the creatures, the endless march, it had all been leading to this moment. Sentinel Hills wasn't a town. It was a trap, a prison for souls. We weren't soldiers. We were sacrifices. The land had called us and it had claimed us. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the endless line of soldiers marching, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They were all there from every war, every battle that had ever been fought. And now they were part of the land, part of the march that would never end. I am part of it now, too. First story. The Silent March of Larksfield. The air was thick with smoke as I sat crouched behind the ruined remnants of what used to be a farmhouse. The remnants of war still smoldered around me, burnt husks of trees, shattered windows, and the constant drone of helicopters above. It was the summer of 2024, and the war had spread across America like a wildfire. No one was safe anymore. Not even in the small town of Larksfield, where I'd spent most of my life. We never thought the war would reach us. We had always been too small, too insignificant for anyone to bother. But that was before the army came, before the mercenaries, before the screams. I don't know how it all began, but I do know how it ended, or rather, how it's still ending. The soldiers didn't just fight, they changed. The men who walked the streets of Larksfield were not the same men who left to fight. Something had infected them, something darker, something that couldn't be wiped off with a shower or a prayer. The first signs were small. The soldiers would pause in the middle of their patrols, staring into the distance, their eyes wide with terror. Then they'd snap out of it and carry on like nothing had happened. But I saw the fear in their faces. I knew they weren't all right. One night, I decided to follow them. I had to know what was happening. It was a mistake I'll never forget. I followed them into the woods at the edge of town, where the trees grew thick and the darkness felt almost suffocating. I kept my distance, careful not to make a sound. The soldiers, led by Sergeant Harris, walked in eerie silence, their boots crunching over the dry leaves beneath them. Then they stopped. At first, I thought they had heard me. But no, they didn't move. They stood there, frozen, staring into the shadows. I crept closer, heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw it. From the depths of the forest, figures emerged, slowly, deliberately. They were tall, skeletal, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural pale light. They moved with the same mechanical precision as the soldiers. The soldiers didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice them. But I did. I backed away slowly, but something inside me urged me to stay, to watch, to understand. As the figures approached the soldiers, they began to speak, not in any language I recognized, but in a low, rhythmic chant. The soldiers responded, their voices hollow, as though they were speaking through a layer of thick, wet mud. It was then that I understood. They were no longer human. They had become something else. The figures reached out, their fingers long and gnarled, and touched the soldiers on the forehead. A dark cloud seemed to engulf the soldiers' faces, and for a brief moment I thought they were being consumed. But then they turned and began to marching toward Larksfield, as if they had a singular purpose, a purpose that I couldn't comprehend. I didn't know what they were or what they had become. All I knew was that they weren't the men I once knew. They weren't human anymore. They were something far worse. I ran back to town, my lungs burning, my legs weak from fear. But when I reached Larksfield, I saw something far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The entire town had gone silent. There were no lights, no movement, no sounds. It was as though the very life had been sucked out of it. I rushed to the local diner, where I knew some of the last survivors had gathered. The door was locked, but I could see their faces pressed against the glass. Their eyes were wide with terror, just like the soldiers had been. But when I tried to open the door, something was wrong. It wouldn't budge. Suddenly, I heard the sound, a low, guttural hum. It grew louder, filling the air until it was all I could hear. I turned around, and there they were, the soldiers, but not the soldiers I had followed. No, these were something else entirely. They were rotting, their skin hanging in tatters, their eyes black and hollow. They moved in perfect unison, as though controlled by some invisible force. And behind them, marching in rhythm, were the figures from the woods, the glowing eyes, the skeletal forms. They had brought the soldiers back, and now they were bringing them to us. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I turned and ran down the street, desperate to escape, but it felt like the very town itself was closing in on me. The buildings seemed to grow taller, the streets longer. I couldn't escape. I saw them then. The soldiers, the figures, they were marching toward us, to our very doorstep. And I realized in that horrible moment that this was the end. This was how it all ended. There was no escape. There was no one left to save us. The war had consumed us all, and now we were nothing but the last remnants of a forgotten world. I knew I would never leave Larksfield. No one would. As the march continued, I heard one final, chilling thought in my mind. This was the war we couldn't win. And it wasn't over. It had only just begun.